Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. We are honored that you're all here, regardless of the weather reports and all the problem they are forecasting for the next couple of days. When we announced about this group of 3 wise men, I had many emails and calls. When are we having the 3 mafias in Vermont? That was the second one, and others complain, how about women? 3 women. So we have started all new revolution here. I hope you will all enjoy the discussion, the lecture, and the issues raised by these 3 distinguished universal gentlemen that will bring peace and harmony among all the people of all religions, of all nations, right here in Vermont. And we hope you share it with your friends when you leave. Before I introduce our speakers, let me make 2 impolite requests. First is please turn off your mobile phone so we don't disturb the speakers and others. And second impolite request, those of you who have not yet become a member of Windham World Affairs Council, it is going to be a cost of hamburger a year for annual membership, and perhaps you can consider avoiding eating 1 hamburger and becoming a member, so you will be there. With this impolite request, let me, before we begin tonight's program, I would like to announce a new series of talk that will be offering in partnership with Marlboro College. The series entitled Engaging the World will be offered on 5 Wednesday evenings, beginning on February 13th and continuing through April. The first 2 talks in the series will be placed in February and will be held right here in this beautiful open church, and hope people can enter. I would like now to invite President Kevin Quigley of Marlboro College to tell us more about this program. You can also pick up flyers about the series available on the table nearby. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Isaac, and good evening, everybody. It's really good evening. It's wonderful to have you all here, and I wanted to thank Isaac for organizing this and Scott for being a wonderful host, and everybody for coming out. I also wanted to acknowledge many friends, alums, faculty, staff, students from Marlboro College. It's great to be part of this event, which is really a prelude to a series that I'm very pleased we're doing for the 2nd time with the Windham World Affairs Council. This is, as Isaac said, it's a 5-part series, but it really has 3 phases to it. The first speaker will take up the conversation, I think, where the 3 wise persons. I'll leave it off. His name is Michael Gilligan. He's the president of the Henry Luce Foundation, and he's going to speak about the role of philanthropy in trying to understand and address the issues of religion and international affairs. The second speaker is Kirk Talbot. Kirk works on issues of governance and transparency as an advisor to the World Bank and also an advisor to the Omidyar Foundation, or the Omidyar Network. The Omidyars, as you may know, were some of the co-founders of eBay. The third speaker is Sharon Stash, who is affiliated with Georgetown University and was the deputy head of the Center for Global Health at the Center for Strategic and International Studies that was set up by Zabrinsky and Kissinger. And she was one of the draftspersons of President Bush's PEPFAR program, the Program for Emergency Relief on AIDS in Africa. The fourth speaker is Joel Rosenthal. He's the president of the Carnegie Council on Ethics and International Affairs. The Carnegie Council is one of the legacy institutions from Andrew Carnegie, set up in the 19-teens, and with a particular focus of trying to understand how ethics affects the conduct of international affairs. The fifth in the series is former member of Congress Sam Farr, who started his career as a Peace Corps volunteer in Colombia. Based on that experience and long service in the House of Representatives, was deeply engaged in the conduct of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. So this series is really designed to address important issues in international affairs that don't get a lot of attention in the popular press or even in the policy world, but are fundamental to how we engage with the rest of the world. I mentioned it was in 3 phases. The first involves a seminar where these speakers who will join us at these Windham World Affairs events come to campus. They participate in a seminar. They give the students some readings beforehand. We discuss them in class. Then they go to our dining hall and have dinner with the students and community members. And if any of you are interested to join with some of those speakers, please let me know. And then really the capstone of their experience is to have a chance to talk with our community. So I very much hope that you have a chance to participate, and I look forward to seeing you at those events. And again, thank Isaac and the Windham World Affairs Council for being our co-host. And would you like me to introduce Scott, or do you want to do that? You do that.
You can do that if you want.
Okay, so my notes said I'm supposed to turn it over to Scott. So here's Scott, our host.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I'm glad there's such a fantastic turnout. It's either because you're very interested in the topic or you're just afraid you're going to be snowbound for a few days and wanted to get out. Nonetheless, I'm thrilled that you all are here. I would just like to briefly provide a short contextualization of why sort of we're gathered here. Martin Luther King Day, which we'll acknowledge and celebrate on Monday. And just sort of a brief look at the signs of the times to place this whole forum in context. In South Africa, while confronting the heresy of apartheid, Christian theologians drafted what is known as the Kairos document. And Kairos is a Greek word meaning time. But more specifically, it is a time that was special. It was a God-given window of opportunity to take a stance or to act. Some believe that in our country, we are at a Kairos moment presently, a special time in which decisions and opportunities must be taken. And if they are not, they will be missed forever. During these Kairos moments, resistance movements have sprung. In recent times, examples of Kairos moments could be the Civil Rights Movement, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, Tiananmen Square in China, the Orange Revolution. In Russia, there's the Pussy Riot, and our own, some might say, belated Me Too movement. One need not be news junkies to hear of and have opinions on the Black Lives Matter movement and or the contestation between Colin Kaepernick and the National Football League. Currently in the United States, we may be reaching what might be considered sort of a massive mega Kairos moment, the likes of which we have not seen perhaps since the Civil War, and I sense will far exceed the Watergate era. Due to the constant chaos and the seemingly blatant disregard for any semblance of decorum and civility in the Trump era, I think we are headed toward a constitutional crisis, if we are not already there. The United States government is at war with itself on multiple fronts, The executive branch is even at war with its own Justice Department. In our own faith community at Center Church, we have heard from our pulpit a statement entitled, "Reclaiming Jesus." And this statement was signed by dozens of our own country's most prominent theologians, public theologians, as they examine the signs of the times and reflect theologically and, in their particular faith tradition, Christologically, on the current state of the nation. This evening, we will briefly touch upon the role of our respective faith traditions, or at least the three Abrahamic traditions. But we also hope to bring in other voices, Baha'i, Quaker, and Buddhist, and many others, reflect on their respective faith traditions as they concern resistance movements. We hope this evening to review the past, to analyze the present, and discern the future, or at least our part in it. I would just like to introduce our three panelists this evening. The first is the Reverend Bryan Fulwider. Bryan is an ordained minister who has served as a local church pastor for more than 30 years in both the United Methodist Church and the United Church of Christ. In 2012, with his friends and colleagues, Rabbi Steve Engel and Imam Mohammed Masuri, Fulwider founded and co-hosts the weekly radio show Friends Talking Faith with the Three Wise Guys. He serves as executive producer of the show and the managing partner for the production company. He is founding president and CEO of the nonprofit Building US. Bryan serves as chairperson of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida, as well as the chair and the professional advisory group. He serves with the Florida Hospital CPE program. He is a board member of the Florida Interfaith Coalition for Reproductive Health, the Florida Statewide Coalition for Gun Safety, the Atlantic Institute, and is a member of the host committee of Equality, Florida's 2019 Greater Orlando Gala. Bryan is a life trustee of Chicago Theological Seminary, and he has two adult sons and is a grandfather to Louisa. He makes his home in Central Florida. Our second panelist is Amer Latif. Amer is a professor of religious studies at Marlboro College since 2003. His research focuses primarily on Islamic mystical texts and practices. He is also interested in the issues surrounding cultural translation and has published translations of the poetry of Rumi, the 13th century Muslim scholar and mystic. A current resident of Putney, he grew up in Pakistan and came to the United States for college. After getting a BA in physics from Bard College, he received his PhD in comparative literature from Stony Brook University. He's currently working on two books. The first, Only God is Good, Islam in the Words of Jesus, and Reading the Quran with Rumi is the second. Having grown up in Pakistan and with an undergraduate degree in physics, Amer thrives on studying and creating containers that are capacious enough to hold seeming contradictions, such as science and religion, East and West. And our third panelist...
He hasn't mentioned that he's a star squash player.
I said... Our third panelist is Jim Levinson. He is a research professor at Tufts University, and he has served as spiritual leader of Jewish synagogues in New England, including the Brattleboro Area Jewish Community, for the past 25 years. Under his leadership, the BAJC was nationally recognized for its efforts in partnership with the SIT Graduate Institute to facilitate Muslim-Jewish understanding through the Salam Shalom program. Levinson also was an organizer of the 1995 Interfaith commemoration in Poland, marking the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz concentration camp. Jim, who facilitates the Compassionate Brattleboro Committee and does active prison ministry, is descended from a long line of European rabbis and cantors. His great-grandfather composed the first Zionist songs written in Hebrew. Before I ask our panelists our first questions, I thought since we had three here, it sort of reminds one of all of those sort of classic jokes. You know, a rabbi, a priest, and a imam walk into a bar, although I don't know if it would be a bar. But I just thought I would begin with a little bit of humor. A rabbi, an imam, and a priest gathered around a coffin at a funeral service, and someone asked them, "What do you wish would be said about you if you were in the coffin?" Well, the priest said, "I would want someone to say that he sought to follow in the footsteps of the Redeemer." And the imam said that he was a light unto the world. And the rabbi paused and he said, "When people look down upon me in the coffin, I just want them to say, 'Look, he moved.'" Well, I wish you guys would come to my church because my jokes don't go over half as well during my sermons as they do here. We are going to continue our evening basically in segments, sort of like the radio show which Bryan and his three colleagues host. We will sort of have this segmented part of our presentation until 8:30, and then at about from 8:30 to at least 9 o'clock, we would like to open it up to questions that have been asked before this evening, but also to invite some questions from the audience. But first, let us begin hearing a bit about our panelists more personally. I'd like to ask you, Bryan, Amer, and James, what in your life journey brought you here? In other words, what catalyzes your interest in this discussion tonight and your understanding that interfaith dialogue and resistance movements are important in, as Mordecai once said to Esther, in such a time as this?
I want to begin by saying thank you to the Windham World Affairs Council and to my colleagues who I had the privilege of spending the evening with at the home of Eska and Roslyn on Wednesday evening for a delightful meal and great conversation. And it is a privilege and honor for me to be here and to share in this time. So thank you for all being here for this conversation tonight. When I was a kid, my mother worked in a lot of community kind of organization things, and for some reason she had this unbelievably large collection of card tables. And so when I would have guys over for a sleepover when I was a kid, we would set these card tables up, and my mother would get a pile of sheets or blankets or something, and she'd set them on the tables, and we would drape them over, and we'd have these great little tents, you know, these little habitats that we could kind of live in. But what we found is, as we kind of lived in our own little tent, that it was fine for a few minutes, and then it was really kind of boring. So we would start pushing those card tables together, and we'd start opening up the flaps, and we'd suddenly have this big area. You know, it was spacious, and there were people there, and we could have fun and talk. And for me, that has become a symbol of the way I believe life ought to be. It's okay to have your card table, but really you ought to bump it up against somebody else and open it up and get to know them and become acquainted with them. I grew up in a time and community which was in transition in Inglewood, California, and I had a very close friend of mine as a kid growing up who was we would say today, outcast or shunned, and even more to the point, we would say today, he was bullied. And it just made me so angry that he was treated with such disrespect. And somehow within me there grew this sense that basic decency and justice were the very center of life. And that if we were going to in any way figure out how to live as community, we had to find ways to bump those card tables up against each other and open up those flaps and begin to communicate and relate to and be part of one another's lives. So when I went to college, I realized that I was in this very closed bubble in this small evangelical Christian college in the foothills of the Ozarks in Arkansas. And I had a great experience there, but I realized that it really wasn't like the world ought to be. And so I ended up in a seminary where the world came to the seminary. And suddenly Christianity had to relate to and understand all of those folks from other places and other backgrounds and other cultures and other religions. And that began to shape my understanding of the kind of world I wanted to be part of and I wanted to see. So through my ministry, as soon as I got back to Arkansas, I asked, where is the Interfaith group here? And there was a group that met and began to work with them. And so the same was true when I came to Florida, and I asked where the Interfaith group was, and my friend Imam Musri was leading that group at the time. The final part of that story is that's how the rabbi and the imam and I met. We had lunch every week for many years, and the show is entitled Friends Talking Faith with the Three Wise Guys. So Friends Talking Faith is kind of the serious part of the program name. The Three Wise Guys is a reminder that we really are just three guys. And we're aware that we're three guys. And people said, why don't you have a woman on the show? And we based the show on our friendship. And this is a long 20-year now friendship. And so that's the context of the show. But the model is to say to those who are listening and are part of it, we can share this life together. We can bump our tables up against each other and get to know each other. And life is a lot more fun when you do that. And so we've been at this since April Fool's Day of 2012. We'll have our 7th anniversary. We think that's a fitting birthday for our program. So thank you. It's delightful to be here.
Amer.
Thank you, Brian, and good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure being here with all of you, and it has been a real pleasure to meet Brian through this process and to share a conversation and to know the lovely work that he does. And once again, I think, really excited and humbled to be here with all these community members in different communities from different parts of my life. So to answer the question, Scott, that you have asked about how do I find myself here right now, I guess I'll just begin with right now. When I think of resistance, I primarily think of an internal resistance, an internal struggle. The resistance, as I've come to see it, the question, I guess I can say, way I would frame it, that the question about resistance for me right now is, how do I not fall into the trap of hating those against whom I'm resisting? How do I not get consumed by the anger that naturally arises as a result of seeing injustice? And there have been steps along the way in which, just as Brian was mentioning, that the question in the world has kept on opening up. I think I was blessed growing up in Pakistan to be just thrust into this milieu in which there was a certain vision of the world, which is usually associated with Sufism, but it's a very universal vision. And the religion of love, and love is the way in which Islam is interpreted. But I grew up in a country that had the legacy of colonialism, yet the official language was English. We were studying English. You know, the latest technologies were coming from England. So one of the first struggles I would say that I can articulate looking back right now was how not to get stuck in a place where I would always remain the colonized and they would always remain the colonizers. So coming to the US was a really important step in that direction of going beyond some of those boxes that if one is not exposed to the other, one can find oneself stuck in. So that people can be released and freed from the kind of stereotypes that one would have, which are natural, that arise. So it has been a journey of coming to that place and then finding myself also in situations where the feelings of anger that arise at injustice were too overpowering. Like there were moments at which I was consumed by anger. And that was not a very good place. You know, states are stations, states are places. So the place of anger. And to see the glimmers that I could actually be hating people as well. That was, it's a scary place to be. And fortunately, you know, possibilities were shown of how to go beyond that place. So I think some of you here have a long history of marching against things that you can see are going to result in vast disasters. The one in my sort of American part of my life was when I was part of this worldwide movement that marched against the proposed invasion of Iraq. You know, millions of people all around the world when we marched. And to see it just do nothing and to see the tragedies unfold, which we are bearing the fruit of and noticing right now what we have done to the world. That was a really important point. So at that moment, that was, I would say, one of the hardest parts of my life in how to move through it, beyond it, in a way that was not destructive. So there are perspectives, I found, that refuse to stay in an either-or situation. Like Scott pointed out in the biography, I really started appreciating the perspectives that are able to hold both together. The people who are the oppressors as well as the oppressed. So there's a verse in the Quran in which God says, God is the light of the heavens and the earth, which is both in the east and the west. So the light is the container that is holding both the east and the west together. So it's not a very popular perspective, but it's a vision that really calls to me. And it's a possibility that I've become more and more interested in making and actualizing it in my life and facilitating it in my teaching and in the places that I visit. So, yes, how not to be consumed, how to be able to view life as a game. As Jimmy pointed out, I do play squash. One of my dear squash partners, Blessed, is sitting over there. And one of the things about sports, and I think games is so great, is that you play the game, you play hard, you know, and you play to win, and yet at the end, the ideal is you shake hands, whether you have lost or you have won. So that's become a working metaphor for me. How can I find a way in which, even as I'm resisting and working with people whose positions I consider to be horrible, first, not to give in to hatred, and yet be able to hold a way in which I am not totally, pushing them aside, and be able to shake hands with them. And I find that only possible through the religious perspective, for me at least. It's only the witness of God that allows for knowing that somebody else is watching. This is a game. There is going to be an exit from here. So that's the way in which I find religion very pertinent to this moment. So I think I'll stop.
Thank you, Amer. James, can we hear from you, a.k.a. Jim?
I have very special feelings for this building, I have to say, and for this church. Our Brattleboro Area Interfaith Initiative met in this very room for 12 years. Our Compassionate Brattleboro Committee meets in the library. And the basement Sometimes the holiest places in the church are in the basement. Whereas, as many of you know, there is this extraordinary work that's done to wrap up clothing for Syrian refugees living in Greece and other places. But also, where we had Amer Javed and others of us had some of the most memorable Eid commemorations I could imagine. So thank you to Scott and to Center Church and all of you. I grew up in Pittsburgh in a Jewish community. Yes, in a Jewish community. I went to a high school of 3,000 where maybe there was 100 that were not Jewish. I grew up with a mother who was very, how would you say it, Judeo-centric, and really very, very strong feelings about Jews and about Christians, all of whom, as far as she was concerned, were anti-Semitic. And she was reminding me constantly that I'm descended from 14 generations of rabbis and cantors. When I became a rabbi, that was sort of the perspective that I brought to it, and I hope some evolution took place, largely because I became exposed to the prophets. And more about the prophets in a bit. But I found in studying the prophets, I was really getting to the heart of peace and justice and resistance. And it led me to contemporary prophetic figures, not all of them Jewish. Abraham Joshua Heschel and Leo Beck and Dorothy Day and Daniel and Philip Berrigan. So this idea of justice and resistance very much informed the work I did for many decades in Asia and Africa and Latin America on public health and nutrition, leading to very active involvement in peace dimensions of activity in those countries, Gandhian activities in India, and as Scott knows, anti-apartheid activity in South Africa. I sometimes got in trouble. Hopefully I did a little bit of good. And that got me actively involved in resistance in this country, primarily beginning with the anti-nuclear movement, doing civil disobedience, doing some time in prison. It got me into a battle with my own family that, believe it or not, was involved in companies that made munitions, shells for the Vietnam War, and tried to export parts of nuclear weapons to apartheid South Africa. And finally, a story that brings us an interfaith perspective. I was invited to an event organized by Philip and Daniel Berrigan in Washington to be a Jewish presence there. And this was an incredible weekend that we spent together, culminating in civil disobedience on the steps of the Pentagon. A die-in. Some of you know about die-ins from, after the die-in, while a woman was singing this mournful song about Hiroshima, and then a van pulled up, an ambulance-like van, and the idea was that some of us would get up and pick up these bodies and load them into the van. So I stepped forward to pick up a body. Who knew who the body was, and picked up this body, and there was something that happened when I did that I started weeping, and I couldn't let go of this body, and all I could think of were dead Vietnamese children that my family had been responsible for, and so many other injustices that I had witnessed and maybe been complicit in one way or the other. I couldn't let go of this body. It was some months later that I learned who this body was. This was a man from Philadelphia who worked for General Electric until they became involved in the production of nuclear weapons and parts of weapons and the like, and he quit. And he went to, just a few days before this, a Christmas Eve Mass at his Catholic church. And at the end of the Mass, some of the faithful gathered around the creche with the priest. And what did the priest do? He took pieces of straw from the creche and gave it to each person there and said, put this piece of straw in your shoe and do something that Jesus would have done. And he went to Washington, and he was the body that I couldn't let go of. Amen.
Jim, listening to that story, I wanted to give you lots more time. But I'm going to now, because I'm going to ask you to respond first to my next question put to the three of you. I would like to ask each of you to just briefly share with us this evening, with the audience, some of the seminal principles of your respective faith traditions and the source or the sources from which these principles are derived.
Thanks, God. And let me begin with the word Israel. Where did that word come from, and what does it mean? Anybody know?
Can we raise hands?
John knows.
It's wrestling, the name change of Jacob.
It was Jacob's, and John has a son named Jacob. Jacob wrestling with the angel was then given the name Israel, meaning wrestling with the divine. And it's something that the Jews take some pride in, I think Muslims as well. The idea that we don't just accept blindly, but we're willing to wrestle. There's a beautiful Yiddish poem that says, God will love us if we wrestle with God, if we fight with God, if we box with God. God is only unhappy with us when we don't care. When we don't care. Not all of Hebrew Scripture is about nonviolent love. If you read Joel, it says, believe it or not. Anybody know what I'm going to say? Beat your plowshares into swords. What the heck? But the prophets were another story. And that, to me, is the essence of what Judaism has to say about resistance and peace. Amos saying, let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. The prophet Isaiah saying, the Lord has anointed me to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners. Where's my friend Jean that does beautiful prison ministry and up in Springfield? The pronouncements made by these prophets and the symbols of their lives. Jeremiah, for example, wearing an ox yoke around his neck to symbolize the oppression under the Babylonian Empire. Ezekiel memorialized the fall of Jerusalem by building a model of the city and lying down next to it for a year. And a few other prophet-like figures, women like Shiphrah and Puah. Do you know the story of Shiphrah and Puah? The Hebrew midwives who defied the Pharaoh's orders by safely delivering the sons of Hebrew slaves? And how about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who, like Colin Kaepernick, took a knee, essentially, by refusing to show the required patriotism at one of King Nebuchadnezzar's state parades. More about how that moves into the contemporary period in a little bit.
I think for me, as well as for majority of the Muslims, the sources that one looks forward back to for inspiration and for guidance are the Quran and the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and there's a really symbiotic relationship between them. And I remember growing up hearing stories about, and as they're told in the Quran as well, about the Prophet Muhammad, the reason why, continuing in the tradition of prophecy, which is very much the way in which the Quran sees the Prophet Muhammad's mission, is a preaching of and against and on behalf of the poor, the orphans, the marginalized, the widows, and the way they're being treated in the fairly wealthy but tribal Meccan society. So that's really the beginnings of Islam, is this very aware and sensitive soul, the beautiful Muhammad, looking at the situation, not being happy. And the beginning of revelation starts in that moment of human suffering, and as a response to alleviating and restoring the social balance to a more equitable state. So the Quran and his life are there, but the one saying of Prophet Muhammad that made a real impression on me when I was a small child, we were taught this, was this one of his sayings. He said that if one of you, Muslims, sees something that should be denied or something that's wrong, then do something about it with your hand. If you cannot do something about it with your hand, then do something about it with your tongue. And if you cannot do something about it with your tongue, then at least consider it wrong inside your heart. And that saying has become even more important for me as the years have gone by, because I find in that such a mercy and compassion. And something else he said, that to consider something that's wrong in your heart, it's the weakest form of faith. So he says that, and that is the weakest form of faith, just to consider it wrong in your heart. So there is a value placed. You must do something. But if you cannot, then consider, talk about it. If you can't even do that, then at least know that it's wrong. And that's the weakest form of faith, just considering it wrong in your heart. But as I've growing older with life experience, looking at others, and looking at the diversity of human beings, and some of the debates that take place even within really well-meaning, sincere social justice circles, I find that sometimes the debates that are taking place are always framed in an either-or situation, whereas this source allows me to not only be a little bit more compassionate to myself, given my capacities at that moment, but also with others, not knowing their situation. So rather than putting them in a camp of those who are just not doing anything and hence are part of the problem, I do not know their inner situation. So there's a tremendously pragmatic and merciful aspect to that continues to grow. So that is the source that really I feel like I taught to all Muslim kids. Yeah.
In terms of what has struck me in my faith as a Christian, I think that probably the text that has most shaped that thinking is the story of really the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, where it says that he went to the synagogue, he picked up the Isaiah scroll, did the reading for the day, and it said, "I've come to preach good news to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed." And then he said, "And this has been fulfilled today in your hearing," and made a lot of enemies, and they tried to take him out and throw him off the cliff near the synagogue. But in so doing, he was relating, of course, his own sense of, exactly as Jim talked about, those great prophets from of old who were calling for this transformation of the world through justice and through through the resistance to oppression and evil. So every time you turn around in the New Testament, Jesus is arguing with the powerful. He's either arguing with the powerful religiously or the powerful in terms of the political realm. And he's arguing for this very vision that he begins with, or that at least the textual material begins with, in relation to this Isaiah passage. And so that really becomes the hallmark of this ministry of compassion and of change, but it is about resisting. And so as we began to see the formation and development of the social principles from Rauschenbusch and from others, and the rise of the Catholic worker movement, as Jim talked about it with Dorothy Day, and the ministries with those who were in oppressive work situations, through the various labor movements and union movements. Throughout the 20th century, we've seen this shift in Christianity, and we've seen resistance from the other side to that. But it could not have been unless those kinds of works, which were very much interfaith, as Jim talked about. I mean, they crossed all lines in terms of faith communities. It could not have been that Dr. King would have had the kind of platform that he had when in 1955 Rosa Parks was thrown off that bus. And you'll remember, she was thrown off that bus, that same bus driver threw her off a few years earlier. And it was not, if we characterize Rosa Parks' defiant act, resistance to oppression and evil, if we define that as simply an older black woman who was tired after a long day of work as a seamstress, and she just didn't want to move for some white dude who told her to get up and give him his seat, we miss the real point. Rosa Parks had been a lifelong teacher of resistance in her AME church. She had tirelessly worked with the youth to help train them to resist this kind of oppression. So and we had some really interesting questions about, well, what do we mean we're resisting? We're talking about resistance in the spirit of leaders like King and Gandhi and others. We're not talking about just resisting, the arguments against the NRA or something. We're talking about resisting the kinds of oppression and evil that really thwart justice in our society and community. I think we all probably understand that, but it's a fair question, and we need to be much more we need to be much more clear that I have just 1 minute left. So we are in a very strange time right now. I mean, I think Scott characterized it very well when he talked about what's happening in our world and in relation to the democratic principles that we have held on to, which are the safeguards of this ability for people of good faith and people of no faith to stand together for principles of justice and good. They are being threatened every day. And I was just reading an article before coming over here about the Russian onslaught of disinformation and how that's a strategic, tactical process. They are producing this, they're weaponizing this disinformation, and they're disseminating it to us in ways that we have got to stand against all of these kinds of things that are putting at threat the democracy which builds justice and hope for us. Thank you.
As sometimes I watch the news, as many of you do, I am stunned at the numbers of examples of weaponization. It comes in the form of talking points. It comes in the form of strategic social media posts. It comes in the form of chronic lying. There are so many forms of this weaponization, and when I watch it day after day, I become overwhelmed, and to be honest, I even sort of lose perspective. For me, as a historian, sometimes history for me provides a great deal of perspective when I sort of feel lost in the present. So may I ask the three of you to please share with me and with the audience a specific but emblematic historical example of a resistance movement arising from your particular faith tradition, perhaps in which a marginalized constituency challenged the power and the control of a hegemon. Thank you.
I'm going to beg everybody's indulgence and speak about two, but I hope fairly quickly. Because I feel like Islam is a lot of times, there's dearth of examples about Islamic history, so I think it's good to think about that. So the Prophet Muhammad's life, starting from in Mecca as somebody who was powerless and could only speak, is a model for many for non-violent resistance. And throughout his life, as circumstances changed, he went through a whole number of ways of resistance to obstacles in the formation of a just society. So over the course of Islamic histories, for the last 1,400 years, there have been a range of Muslim movements. Some of them have used violence, and some of them have not used violence. So I think Islamic non-violent movements are fairly unknown. So I wanted to point out one of them from fairly contemporary period. So this is a movement that arose in the northwestern frontier province which is called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa right now, the frontier. And there was a person named Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who was a contemporary of Gandhi and a friend of Gandhi. And he started a movement called the Red Shirts, which was called Khudai Khidmatgar, the servants of God. And they were all, at one moment, it was formed like an army, but there was 100,000 people enlisted, men and women. A social reform agenda, education, as well as resisting the British, but they were all sworn to non-violence. So that story is not usually told. So that's part of the legacy of Islam as well. And he, even though Gandhi was practicing, he was putting the non-violence in from a Hindu perspective, but also Meg has brought to my attention, Meg Mott, my friend here, that Gandhi had been given a copy of Tolstoy's work. And so resist no evil coming from the Christian tradition had an impact on Gandhi. So it's a lovely example of this interfaith kind of transmission. So he was also known as Badshah Khan or Abdul Ghaffar Khan. So if you search, I think it would be interesting to know more about that. So that's an example of a non-violent movement that worked against the British and played a huge role in combination with many other movements that were around too. And the other point I wanted to make was hopefully provide a slightly different take on contemporary politics in the Islamic world with the special case study of Pakistan. So as most of you know, that Pakistan has a new government. Imran Khan, the former cricketer, is the prime minister, and his party was called the Justice Party, which he founded in the late 90s. Total agenda was anti-corruption. And he was ridiculed, made fun of by the ruling elites, who had, in some ways very similar to us, a rotating kind of way in which they would come into power when democracy was in session. They would share, go out, come back. It was a revolving door for the same group of people. And they were literally looting the country. So finally, Imran Khan has prevailed, that Justice Party has prevailed. And I was talking to a friend in Pakistan recently, and I asked him, how is the government doing? He said, they're doing okay. They're failing on some things, falling through on other things. But everybody in my circle, he said, is so happy because nobody expected these pharaohs, talking about Pakistani older politicians, to come down in their lifetime. So I think there's another example of the interfaith aspect, that in the Islamic imagination, the story of Moses and Pharaoh, the Israelites, is used as a way to think about our own struggles, not even the prophetic story. But Imran Khan's parties, and he's very clear about that, his goal is to establish an Islamic welfare state, just like the Prophet established, where the poor, the orphans, the widows are taken care of. So that's an example of a group, currently a political group, that has come to power, but is based on Islamic principles, and they see there and find their inspiration in the life of the Prophet.
In the early 1960s, a friend of mine by the name of Tom Davis was a young UCC minister. He and his wife both were clergy, and he took his first assignment as the chaplain of Skidmore College, at that time an all-women's college in New York. And he said to his wife, very sage woman, well, this is really great. He said, what kind of problems could these young women have, in college? And of course, he found out pretty immediately. The very first thing that happened was a young woman came to his office and asked if he had money that he could help contribute to a friend of theirs who they were trying to help. And he said, well, what's going on? What does she need the help with? And she said, well, I'd rather not say. And he said, well, could you tell me in confidence and just trust? And finally, she did tell him in confidence that her friend needed to terminate a pregnancy. So they were collecting money to send her to Mexico so that she could get the health services that she needed as a young woman. Tom asked if he could speak with her, and finally the young woman agreed to speak with him. They talked together. He asked if she could tell her father about this. Her mother had died some years ago. She said, oh, I don't think so. And so they went through all of this, and finally she agreed that if he sat with them, the father could know. And so they did. The father, he said, was actually quite wonderful, and he found a doctor in New York who would do health exams, and often the young woman would need a DNC in these days. We understand the time. One of the students at Skidmore College was a young woman named Sally Ann. And Sally Ann became pregnant during her mid-years of college. So she decided that all she could do was leave college, end her college career, get married. 3 weeks after the marriage, there was a miscarriage. Sally Ann's last name was Blackman, and Justice Harry Blackman was her father. And there is no doubt that what happened in regard to his daughter and her not having access really shaped him. And Tom and Justice Blackman had long conversations about this. Tom became one of the founders of the clergy consultation. And in that group that worked with Planned Parenthood, they began to develop the more ancient understandings out of the church about the protecting women's choice and women's rights and women's health and women's justice. And so he, along with many colleagues, began to build this coalition, resisting the kind of current issues of the day on behalf of women who, even today, are not trusted. A friend of mine, Dr. Rebecca Todd Peters, has just released her book, Trust Women. A progressive Christian looks at women's reproductive justice. And she says one of the biggest problems we face in this country is the fact that women are not respected in terms of their decision-making as men already are. And it's a huge issue that we still deal with. So the resistance movement for me in terms of women's reproductive health and justice continues to be, coming out of those days, a conversation that we have to have particularly within Christianity, in regard to religious understandings of respecting and trusting women and overcoming some of these behaviors that are so destructive of the rights and the abilities of women to make the decisions that are best for them and for their future.
Bryan, you've been my pastor for 20 years, and I know a little bit more of that story. Can you perhaps share with others the brief exchange that the minister had with his other ministerial colleague who perhaps did not share the same views. I've heard all of his stories. He's bored me to death with them over 2 decades. But I just want to share, the benefits.
So now he wants me to bore you with all the stories you've heard. Tom said when they began this work, he would go individually to clergy in the community to ask them to help support and work on this important movement, which was a very difficult thing, of course, in those early 1960s, and still is today in many places. But he said he went to his colleague who was a Baptist minister in town, and he told him the work that they were doing and asked if he would join them in helping to provide services and help to young women who might need those services and help. And he said, "Oh no, I absolutely could not do that." He said, "I don't believe in abortion. It's not something I could do." And Tom said they were good enough friends that he could say, "But Jack, if one of your wonderful families in the congregation came and they needed help with this, what would you do if they really had decided this is what they needed to do and the daughter had decided this was what she needed to do?" He said, "Well, I would try to talk them out of it." And he said, "But imagine in this scenario, you can't. They absolutely know this is the right decision. The young woman knows this is the right decision for her and for her future. What would you do?" And Jack said, "Well, I'd send them to you."
Bryan, what was the name of Justice Blackmun's daughter?
Sally Blackmun.
Her sister, Nancy, and I went to college together, played in the orchestra together, and we were boyfriend and girlfriend.
Small world.
That is amazing. That's amazing. That's amazing.
That's the end of the story.
All right. Jim, after that revelation, I'm going to start your time over again. You get fresh time.
When we think of Jewish resistance after Moses and the Pharaoh, we usually think of armed military resistance, usually guerrilla warfare against oppressors, and probably most importantly against the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s. But there was also Jewish resistance against Jewish tyranny. And I'm thinking specifically of the priestly aristocracy in Jerusalem at the time of the Temple. That was in many ways every bit as bad as the Roman occupiers, and very, very troublesome to the less privileged Jews in first century Palestine. If you want to talk more about that, come on up. There's some very sad bits to that. I like to think that we would have had many dear friends in first century, many dear Jewish friends in first century Palestine, but Caiaphas and Herod would not be among them. But let me speak about two contemporary figures that incorporated into their lives, fully incorporated the understanding of the prophetic teachings. One of them, who also fought against Jewish tyranny, was a woman named Tova Hartman, still alive and still working, who rose up against Orthodox synagogues in Jerusalem that refused to be at all inclusive of women. And she started a movement to sensitize Jews, Israelis, including Orthodox Jews, to the importance of inclusion of women. The other one is one of my great heroes, Abraham Joshua Heschel. You can see, just looking at his face, that he embodies what the prophets were all about. And if you doubt, and here's a picture of him with Martin Luther King. And I think maybe we could refer to his writings about the prophets as the definitive writings. So come up and take a look at these afterwards if you like. Heschel was and King were very, very close, and they worked very closely together. And I just want to offer just a few of Heschel's words, which I found so memorable. Heschel was a religious Jew from a Hasidic family in Poland, he said, "It was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a black person to cross certain university campuses." He said, "Let religious leaders call for national repentance and personal sacrifice, and let religious leaders donate 1 month of their salary toward a fund for housing and education for the oppressed in our own country." And then imagine this. He said, "The tragedy of Pharaoh was the failure to realize that the exodus from slavery could have spelled redemption for both Israel and Egypt. Would that Pharaoh and the Egyptians had joined the Israelites in the desert and together stood at the foot of Mount Sinai."
To earth from your...
We have completed the first portion of our program, and as I promised you, in the second and last, until about 9 o'clock, we will open it up to, I would imagine, 3 or 4 questions from the audience we might be able to get in, and 2 or 3 questions that we have received via Facebook and email for people that perhaps could not come, but nonetheless would like their question answered. Let us begin with a question from the audience. And may I just warn, in doing this, we are opening up ourselves to all sorts of abuse. But the shorter and the more comprehensive, or be terse and be substantive, and we'll get more questions in. Yes.
Just a question about the relationship to traditions and resistance, and sort of as Earth, as planet, as being, how do your traditions work with that in the form of resistance?
So the question is regarding resistance and the Earth, the environment, creation.
Sure, yeah. In the Quranic perspective, everything in creation is called a Muslim. So there's verses in the Qurans in which God says, "Have you not seen how to everything in the world is surrendered?" It's like obeying the laws under which they were created. The sun and the star and the moons and the birds spreading their wings. And people, listeners of the Quran, are exhorted to look around, and everything is considered as a sign. And that points, which itself is there and points beyond itself. So in a certain way, human beings are called upon to become more like all other creatures, to find balance, because other creatures are models of balance. So this is right there very explicitly in the Quran, and was codified in Islamic law specifically as prohibition, even in extreme times like war, of, for example, not poisoning wells, not burning crops, not destroying things like that. So that has been used by many Muslim scholars to argue for the immorality, really, of a lot of even contemporary industry. And there were some Muslim scholars who considered, especially, like to take one specific example, nuclear warfare to be an extremely non-religious and non-Islamic way. And that's one of the reasons why Iran waited so long not to get into the nuclear race. it was behind, because they were really paying attention to those religious edicts because they could see the destruction that is caused by it. So in a very strange way, all of the modern armies are, and the modern warfare and what is being used is in response to the threats posed by others. The Islamic law actually does not require that. It actually looks down upon it. So there's lots of resources there for one to mine. And sanctity of the natural world is really raised up.
I think, obviously, in this group, we don't even have to say, but let's be clear that the environment is under incredible assault right now through our own governmental policies and through many around the world. And so we, within the Christian tradition, every major denomination within kind of the more Protestant or non-Roman Catholic traditions all have clear statements about caring for the environment, and the Roman Catholic Church has very clear statements about caring for the environment. Just a quick story. Father Richard Rohr, some of you may know the name, is a friend, and Richard and I were talking one day about this issue of the environment, and he said I was in a house. He's a Franciscan. I was in a house, and we were talking about the backyard of this house that they lived in. It was quite an oasis for birds and squirrels and all kinds of little creatures. And he said there was a tree back in the back corner of the property that they thought maybe they should remove for some reason of aesthetics or need. And they went to the abbot and they said, we were thinking of removing this tree. And the abbot called a council of friars together. And they had this huge meeting in which they debated whether this tree could be removed or not. And he said ultimately they decided it would be just very, very wrong to remove the tree. Now, can you imagine if we took that kind of care for every tree and every animal and every part of creation, how much better we would be? And yet we're living at a time when I think, both the faith communities and those who don't claim a faith but care about people in the world and creatures have to stand against this onslaught. I'm a pathological optimist. I'm hopeful we'll get through it, but we cannot stop resisting the attempt by many in terms of the destruction. It's a matter of faith, I think, for every person who takes faith seriously. Got yours. Got your own.
Jim has to say ditto, but I have to tell you a story about that tree.
All right, tell me.
Okay?
Yeah.
So there were...
He went to the date for that tree. I think that's the story. Your date with that.
Yeah, Jim was probably on the council making the decision. I mean,
There were 4 rabbis, and they were talking about the real true way to make matzah. And 3 of the rabbis say one thing, but the 4th rabbi, Moshe, says, no, it's another way. And they say, the other rabbis say, oh, that's ridiculous. And Moshe says, God knows that I'm right. And if I'm right, God will have lightning in the sky. And there was lightning in the sky. And the other rabbi said, it's summertime. Well, of course there's lightning. Oh, he says, Moshe, okay, if God agrees with me, the lightning will strike that tree. And the lightning strikes the tree. And the rabbis say, yeah, it has to hit something. Moshe says, what do I have to do? What do I have to do? Does God have to speak to you? And a voice says, Moshe is right. And the 3 rabbis look up and they say, it's still 3-2.
Okay. Good environmental humor. Our next question comes via the internet. So remember, though we are focusing sort of on the Abrahamic faiths with our 3 panelists, others should and ought to be brought into the conversation. So this question comes, and it says the Tao teaches, don't resist, don't insist. Can any or all of you on the panel please address that tenet in relation to resisting? And the tenet again is, Tao teaches, don't resist, don't insist.
Well, I was just going to say, one of my dear friends is a Buddhist monk, so there's some connection with Taoism, of course, in Buddhism. He has just finished a new book on Nagarjuna's The Middle Way, in which he sort of helps to talk about the extreme poles that people go to when they think about complete emptiness as the goal of Buddhism. And he said, on the one hand, there are the ultra-materialists who say, the only thing real in life is all the stuff I can collect. There was a report on NPR years ago that said that baby boomers were characterized by saying how much stuff they could collect before they died, and which is kind of a horrifying thought, but unfortunately maybe too true sometimes. On the other side are the nihilists who say, nothing matters. If it's all emptiness, then nothing matters. And Nagarjuna said middle way. It's the middle way, and he's actually, the Dalai Lama uses his exhaustive work on this to teach on the middle way. And so I think that, in the good Buddhist tradition that would say, this is all illusion anyway, is an understanding, I think, of some of the deepest roots of our various traditions, in which we really have to be careful that we don't invest more into all of this stuff than we ought to. At the same time, I don't have a Buddhist friend that is not working for justice, who's really living out their life, who's not working for the rights of those who are marginalized, who is not helping to create a more sustainable world and to be compassionate, obviously one of the four tenets of Buddhism. So Taoism, having some great similarities, I think, is trying to keep us from getting off of the balance of understanding that we have to find that middle way in terms of how we live. But that doesn't mean we don't stand for and with those who need our help and compassion. So there are things we have to resist. I was with a group that runs the Peace and Justice Institute in Orlando. I was telling my colleagues about this, and somebody was saying, well, we're moderate. We don't take a political position. I said, if you're talking about peace and justice, you're taking a position. And it's a very important position, and it's one that we ought to take and celebrate, whether we're in a faith tradition or not. So I think the Tao is trying to help us not be too far off of either end of the spectrum, but also we need to maintain, I think, that sense of the middle way of working toward what creates a sustainable humanity and culture and society.
Yeah, to Bryan's, I think, lovely contemporary example of all Buddhists, being committed and working for justice. I would like to add, I think, just a little bit of a historical perspective. This semester I'm teaching a course that I've taught many times with a colleague, Seth Harter at Marlboro, which is an introduction to Confucianism and Taoism. And we have titled, Jimmy, you'll be happy with this, is titled Wrestling with Ancestors. And trying to get at that universal core that all of us, at all times, work with what it is that we have received from our traditions, whatever those traditions may be, in order to answer and engage with the questions that are facing us at present. So I think that's all of us. We're all wrestle with ancestors, and yes, it's close up, it's sweaty, and perhaps we could also call it dancing with ancestors. Perhaps that'd be a more interesting image, yeah. But from the text, the Tao Te Ching, where it comes from, in that time period, the question is, what is the best way to organize society? What is the most efficacious way to be able to attain the goals of peace? The question is perennial, how do we attain peace? It's in the warring states period that Confucius writes as Analects, and then in relation to Confucius, the Taoist Tao Te Ching is being composed at that time to talk about a slightly different answer of how to go about. So Tao means way or way making. How do we go about this? So this is one answer, don't resist. But it has to incorporate the Confucian side of fairly regimented, ritualized way of holding society together. If everybody followed the rules, we'd be okay. That's a very kind of a pared down and simplistic way of thinking about it. So I think when I hear this, don't resist, I imagine Confucianism as well. It's in relation to it that is saying, don't resist the way you are resisting. And it's not that don't resist forever, at any time. That there's better ways of resisting. There's more skillful ways of resisting, to use the Buddhist terms of upaya. So what is the best way to get our goal? The understanding is still the Confucians and the Taoists and the Buddhists all have a goal. Even the Buddhists have a goal to be liberated. There is a goal. So the question becomes, how do we get to that place? And then we have multiplicity of answers. Middle way is the one that almost all traditions come to in one form or another after the pendulum swings from one side to the other. But this notion of don't resist, this comes from, again, going back to the first question, from nature symbol. Water is the primary symbol, that it follows the natural course. It goes around the rocks. It doesn't fight with it, but it still goes to does what it needs to do. So the Taoists, if I hear them offering these kinds of images for us to ask about what is the best way to do it, and I would say that in the American context, in the current situation, nonviolent means are a form of what Taoists would say. That's a better way of going about it. So that would follow, I think, the Taoist idea.
Amer's words and his story about his squash game calls to mind that my sense that the best of spiritually based resistance is a teaching I learned from Claude Pepin, one of my dear friend Claude Pepin. If you don't know him, you should, who taught me simply engagement with detachment. Engagement with detachment. We will work hard to indict him. If we fail, we will smile and we will try hard to impeach him. And if we fail at that, we will smile once again and get rid of him in 2020.
A question from the audience. Yes.
Yeah,
This might even reach you. Maybe just lean forward. You'll be fine.
can I ask a feminist question?
Please.
One of the earliest religions in our country, America, was deism, which did not have a gender. They believed in a higher power, but not idolatry. And also one of the oldest monotheistic religions, even older than Judaism, I think it's called Zoroastrian. Is that? Yes. Also, that did not have a gender to it. And I question, and I'm not saying I have the answers, I'm just curious of your perspective, but based on what has become a very patriarchal, dominated world, giving a religion a male godhead that knows everything and you should never question him and all that stuff perhaps creates a duality and a sense of conflict, whereas if it was more egalitarian, it would create a more egalitarian and compassionate male-female benevolent society within the whole planet and world.
Let me go first on that one, and to just tell you about my wife Louise was a student at Harvard Divinity School, and she and her fellow students female students did something I thought was very interesting. They wore whistles around their necks. And they wore whistles around their necks. And if any professor would refer to God as he, all the whistles would blow.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, your point is brilliantly made and so important. I have spent a lifetime in ministry not referring to God by pronouns, or if I do, to say she, much more often than he, just as a way to sort of counterbalance this cultural reality. But the truth is, patriarchalism is so deep and so old and so much a part of our cultural world that the resistance to that is absolutely essential. And I'm very hopeful in terms of this issue, especially with my young colleagues, millennial generation below, who continue to work to overcome patriarchalism. One of the young women who I was sharing with our group the other night, who just won in our state legislature, Ana Eskamani, is Iranian by background. Her family, her parents came from Iran. She's a very proud Iranian-American background person. And she represents leadership in a movement that is tremendously hope-filled for me. And, one of her campaign slogans was "Fuck the patriarchy," which for old people like me, I went, But what I saw was this was a bumper sticker. This was not just to be obscene for no particular reason, but to say we have got to continue to address this problem in our culture and society because it's doing huge amounts of damage, and we've seen this pendulum swing back toward patriarchy. But the midterm elections, I think, in terms of what happened in the House, both in terms of culture, in terms of women, is absolutely remarkable. And so it's a very hopeful sign that in times of distress, people do get it, and they pay attention, and they work hard to overcome. We've got plenty more to overcome, but I'm hopeful, and I do think religion is a big culprit often in this, particularly Christian religion, particularly out of my folks, sadly. So,
one of the sermons I once preached in my rural African church in South Africa, which caused 3 rows of deacons to almost faint. The title of the sermon was, "God does not have a penis or a vagina." And the show was over there, yeah. Yes,
yeah,
Amer.
I think I might be the lone dissenter over here, actually. And I think just as in my journey that I was sharing earlier on, coming to a place of trying to find containers that can hold our situations and dualities and pairs, I have gone through I think I would have phrased things quite similarly as you phrased about even up to 10 years ago. But it's my work specifically in mystical traditions, in Islamic mystical tradition in particular. And then Taoism, I think, is very helpful in thinking about it, where the primary image for the source is given as feminine. So it's actually the image of the vagina that is out of the source out of which everything comes. And in Islam, all the verses of the Quran start with the phrase Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Rahman and Rahim, same as Rahman in Hebrew, one can hear the echo, comes from the word for womb. The cosmos grows in God's womb. So even prior to the male God is the female. So while wanting egalitarianism and agreeing with critique of decisions that are made on the basis of perhaps holding on to power, wanting to control, I have now come to think that the desire to use non-gendered language is actually a problematic thing. Because, and I will give you the reason, I think if one is wanting a social justice of a certain kind, then the issue here is this, very simply speaking. I think, like I said beforehand, a perspective, I find it precious, that allows me to be able to hold dualities together, the oppressor versus oppressed. How do I get out of it? I only get out when I imagine a witness which is divine, which is outside of these two pairs. That's the container that holds these pairs together. So God, yes, is beyond those things. And in Indian tradition, God is represented, the statues of God, half male, half female. Beautiful statues, talking about the ambiguity and the multi-gender and the combined nature of God. So in some ways, either God is both or God is beyond that. Let's go back to this notion. Yes. So if the goal is simple at the level of social equality of a certain kind, then that makes perfect sense. But if the goal, even according to religious traditions, is freedom from pairs of opposites that keep on swinging back and forth as a pendulum. Let me use Indian terms because they're a little bit easier. They're non-theistic. Let's go to Buddhism. If the goal is to go outside the circle of samsara, samsara is a cycle that goes on and on and on, then one needs to follow the symbolism that has been revealed from outside of the circle in which we are at. I know it's a very unpopular thing to say right now, but there is a way in which we need to respect the language and the images, because the images are the vehicles through which we are brought out. The Christian, we are in a church right now, imbibe the body and blood of a being. This is not just thinking about it. You are doing it. If you let go of that, what have you got? Just some ideas. So I agree with you. We need to work for equality. I think all the traditions are saying that, and there have been historical injustices. There's lots to work on. But simply using non-gender language, from my perspective, is not a solution, and in fact closes off certain possibilities for our own freedom.
Of course, that's fine. Yeah.
Thank you. Let us go to our last write-in question as we are nearing our time. As we get closer and closer to 9 o'clock, if we are not there already, I will simply ask the audience's permission to go over time, but I want to respect your time. So let us just have one write-in question and perhaps one more question from the audience, and then we can close. Unless there are massive objections, in which I will be democratic. So we had this question come in on Facebook. Why is the theme of your discussion resistance, not affirmation? In other words, is it trivial to say what you oppose and more substantive to say what you propose?
All the questions, by the way, that were written, came in, were really great, each in their own, and I'm sorry we can't address all of them. So we affirm resistance.
There you go.
Y'all are with me?
Done.
Okay. And I think that it's really, really interesting when I talk, and Jim, maybe you'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about things like the commandments. I remember years ago I was in a Bible study group, and the 10 Commandments, we were talking about this, and somebody said, can you write them all in the affirmative? Rather than thou shalt not steal, can you say, let your neighbors have the stuff they have, or whatever. I don't know. But the point was that sometimes it's really wonderful to say what you're going to say in the affirming and the positive in that way. And sometimes you can hardly get the point across as clearly if you don't say, yeah, but this is something that we are opposed to, that we have to resist. And so I think it is absolutely essential. This may be in regard to that whole kind of wholeness or the yin and yang of life, that at times we have to say, yes, affirmation. This is a beautiful statement of who we are and what we believe. And at other times we have to say, and this is not who we are. And this is not what we believe. And I think that's happening in the American conversation right now. I hear it a lot. We think that this is important. We are for this, and we are not for this and this and this. And I think both of them help to clarify. So I think both are necessary in a meaningful dialogue that creates a sustainable society and a just society.
I would say yes, but that's exactly it. We need both. Yeah.
I agree. Let's affirm affirmation and resistance.
So maybe, do you agree if we take one more from the audience and then we conclude? Okay, yes.
Yeah, what to do next? For me, it's clear. I just come to Brattleboro.
Use the mic and please.
May not be on.
Try to make your question.
Good. Yeah, what's next? For me, it's clear. I've come here from Waterbury, Connecticut. I grew up there. It was the brass center of the world. When you talk about military armament, that's all they produced. Well, the brass industry went away. Now it's a deprived community. I pray to God to guide my coming and my going. God guided me here, and now I'm going to go back there and put into practice everything from what I've heard here today. Now, I've come from a culture of African Americans, Dominicans, Hispanic, Mexican, a melting pot. And I've lived with the richest of the rich and the poorest of the poor. What's next? Is there going to be a session where we can brainstorm ideas both on the local, regional, national, world level, or we take that one pebble, that one voice that we have, and throw it out and create ripples?
Thank you very much. You want to have the last word on all three of you and speak on, I think the question is, what's next?
Which kind of fits. You want Amer? You want
Sure,
Amer, you want to begin that?
What's your name? Roberta. I think what's next, I can definitely share that for me, is to continue to work on ourselves. That's, I would exhort everybody that, we have to find those qualities inside first, rather than always looking for it outside. So the source has to be the person, each person. So personal work is a continuous and a must. So after that, of course, depending on what our circumstances are, there are possibilities. If we have the time, if we feel moved that we want to give up our jobs and work at something, then I think it becomes a decision of how to mobilize and what's the best way to mobilize, how to partake in the kind of discourse, and what are the goals of that discourse. Do we simply critique others, or do we actually try and find ways of being together with those whom we disagree with and are still in a handshaking kind of a phase? So specifically in this place, I'm not sure what's next, because I know there's plenty of organizations that, as Jim was saying, are connected with the church, but I know what's next for me is to continue working as a teacher, as a father, as a friend, and as a writer, and trying to contribute in that way. So I'll just, I think, leave it at that for now.
I think education is important. I taught public school for almost 40 years, and I think it has to be education, faith, hope, and love.
Jim, Brian?
Scott, are we making this our last piece?
I think it's a beautiful question for last words.
Way to close. So, Roberta, thank you for the question, and thank you for the thought that I think is so important. When we're doing our radio program, the rabbi on the show always says, "Yeah, that's all nice. Now what are we going to do?" And it's a great question, important question that we have to talk about. I love the King statement, often given credit to him, that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. But you all, being from New England, know very well that was first uttered by Theodore Parker, who was a transcendentalist and universalist or Unitarian clergy person. He and Jim actually attended Harvard together in 1810. He went to Harvard. So, but to me, that is a magnificent statement. However, the moral arc of the universe does not bend toward justice on its own. We have to bend that arc toward justice in all that we do. So I think it is incumbent, as you're saying, Roberta, that we continue to have these conversations. All of you are involved in many things, I know, that try to build communities of justice and compassion and hope. And so I say, continue to do that. And wherever you can be involved, you can't do everything, but know your passion and continue to get in there and do your passion every day and live it. And if you do it for reasons of faith, then let that be your energy. If you do it because you love humanity and you're a humanist, then do it for that reason. Whatever it is that drives you to work toward helping bend that arc of justice, that's what we must do. And that sounds kind of amorphous, but it's the only way we help to preserve and strengthen the democracy that we all love and the community that we all believe is essential to our life together. Thanks.
I think maybe my bottom line on the question would be that the greatest religious struggle in the world today is not between Christians and Muslims, or between Jews and Christians, or between Hindus and Muslims, but rather between those who believe that the divine presence serves all of us, all religions, all races, all nationalities, all genders, and those who believe that the divine is only for them.
Thank you. As moderator, perhaps I will just say what is next for me, and that is to continue to find wonderful, wise, intelligent, and caring mentors. And I have found that in all three of our panelists. So I would say seek out relationships with people that you would like to be like. And I'm so thankful to be in this faith community where there are so many people of faith, Christians, who, if when I die become half the Christians that they are, I will be enormously grateful. And there are those within our community of other faith traditions who are also and should be our role models. So I would seek out relationships and seek out communities of faith that feed you and affirm you and bring to you those role models that you wish to emulate. I have one announcement before I turn the microphone over to our chair, who also has one announcement. That is the Martin Luther King service that was scheduled to be on Sunday at 4 o'clock because of the snowstorm was postponed to Monday, same times. So 4 o'clock, and then following which there will be a spaghetti dinner. We hope by Monday late afternoon, all of you will be brave enough to venture out, and you will come and celebrate and learn and acknowledge a lot of which we have heard this evening. So please come. That Martin Luther King service is here at Center Congregational Church at 4 o'clock on Monday after the snowstorm.
First, I have to express my thanks to all our distinguished speakers and representatives. Of course, here, this gentleman here, I like to call him Dr. Couper, but he said, no, call me something else. We are all grateful for the church to have us here. What I think is the next thing for the world, in addition to what you heard, is to have all the temples, churches, synagogues open to similar discussion, similar activity, similar work. Let all temples welcome people of other religions. Let hear each other, Let's discuss our issues, less similarities and differences, and that would be one that will bring understanding, reduce our difficulties, solve some of our issues, some of our problems, get rid of some of our gangsters, and hopefully give us a better society to live with more peace, more love, and more harmony. Thank you for coming, and good luck going home.